Hello, my name is Jim St. Pierre. I'm going to be speaking today about the history of the Brunswick Mall. I think Brunswick has a really fascinating history of public lands. The grant of our Brunswick Town Commons more than 300 years ago is one of the oldest examples of set-aside public lands in the state of Maine and in the United States. And 200 years ago, 3 local residents in Brunswick conveyed the first real estate that became the Brunswick Mall. First, I want to provide some context, and then we'll talk about the mall. The United States encompasses approximately 2.3 billion acres of land. Historically, 1.8 billion acres were public domain lands belonging to all U.S. citizens. Acquisitions, cessions, and many of the lands stolen after the formation of the Union, including from Native Americans, became part of the public domain. This map shows expansion from the end of the American Revolution to 1853. Alaska was added by purchase from Russia in 1867 for 2 cents an acre. The rest of the story of public lands in our country is mainly about divestiture. During the first century of U.S. history, our national policy was to sell off or give away as much land as possible. Military bounties were handed out as pay for Revolutionary War veterans. Land grants to railroad companies helped finance transcontinental train lines. And through a series of homestead acts to encourage settlement, more than 270 million acres of your public lands were given away free to over 1.5 million people. By the time Euro-American settlement reached the 100th meridian in the West, we came to see that privatizing all our public land was not always the best idea. Our giveaway policies started to change, but due to the massive disposal of public lands, we, the people, have bought back, through our national government, only 4% of the land east of the Mississippi. Maine has a similar, though separate, chronology. The 15th, 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries were all about European exploration, conquering, exploitation, and eventually occupation and settlement here, but not much sharing or conservation. Some towns had public commons, but those were usually for military mustering, shaming sinners in the pillories and stocks, or impounding stray livestock. There were no lands in Maine that became part of the United States' original public domain. However, there were a lot of public lands claimed by the province and then the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, since Maine was acquired by Massachusetts in the mid-1600s. From the end of the American Revolution in 1783 to the Webster-Ashburton Treaty, which finally settled the Maine-Canada border in 1842, was a half-century of intensive privatization. The public policy goal was to get land in Maine into private hands, and we succeeded grandly. By 1854, over 12 million acres in Maine had been granted or sold from the public domain. And by the way, there's a Brunswick connection to the Great Maine Public Lands Giveaway. Several educational institutions were granted townships in northern Maine by Massachusetts. The idea was they would sell the land and use the income to develop their school. Because it was favored, Bowdoin got a twofer, 2 townships east of Moosehead Lake, totaling about 46,000 acres. A buyer contracted to purchase the property in 1833 for $29,440, but defaulted after making a down payment of just $3,440. Eventually, those wild lands were sold, and Bowdoin got the income. By 1878, the disposal of the state public lands in Maine to private owners was essentially completed. We closed our land office that year. Only scattered public lots remained in the unorganized territories. Both nationally and in Maine, the situation started to change around the turn of the 20th century. Organizations such as the Appalachian Mountain Club and Sierra Club started to lobby for conservation. President Teddy Roosevelt convened several conferences which launched a national conservation movement. And eventually, in Maine, we created a system of state parks, got a piece of national forest in the White Mountains, and several wildlife refuges, and we acquired a national park at Acadia and a grand wilderness park at Katahdin, thanks to private initiatives. In the 1960s, we created the Allagash Wilderness Waterway. In the 1970s, we recovered 400,000 acres of public reserve lands and got most of the Appalachian Trail corridor protected. In the 1980s, we launched the Land for Maine's Future program, which has protected over 610,000 acres. In the 1990s and since, we've spent hundreds of millions of federal, state, and philanthropic dollars on working forests, wildlife habitat, and lands for outdoor recreation. We have a new national monument near Katahdin and have secured some of the private holdings in Acadia National Park. So today, in round numbers, I calculate that we have approximately 300,000 acres of federal lands in Maine, 1 million acres of state parks and public lands. Land trusts own about 400,000 acres and hold easements, varying shades of green, on nearly 3 million acres. And there are approximately 120,000 acres of municipal and school recreation lands. However, despite the iconic parks and the impressive acquisitions in recent years, over 93% of Maine is still private. Only 6.5% of the land in our state is in public ownership, one of the lowest proportions in the United States. Even less, under 3% of the 20 million acres in Maine is permanently preserved for its natural character. The United States has set a goal of protecting 30% of our land and water by year 2030, and experts say globally we should protect half the earth by 2050. To achieve that vision, we're going to need to pick up the pace. But what about Brunswick and the Brunswick Mall? Before recorded history, for 100 centuries, native peoples here shared the land. But that changed with European occupation and a different worldview that favored exclusive private ownership. What's amazing, perhaps, is that we have any public lands. In 1717, a travelway was laid out by early Brunswick settlers, stretching from Fort George to McCoy Bay. The 12-rod road became the basis of today's Main Street. But it wasn't a straight line. For a century, what we call Park Row was the main travelway in that part of downtown Brunswick in order to skirt a wetland. In 1804, the section of road between Noble and Pleasant Streets was accepted by the town as a public way. However, the oval of land between Main Street and Park Row was still a swamp. One observer noted that, quote, cows often had to be pried out of the mud where the mall is, unquote. So in the 18th century, there was no Brunswick Mall. In 1817, Brunswick learned that Governor John Brooks was coming for a military inspection. Townspeople decided improvements were needed. A volunteer crew set out to build a straight road on the west side of the wetland in the village with the intent that through traffic would be on the new Main Street. However, travel continued on both streets. This map from the Wheelers' history shows a dotted line, probably where the new segment of Main Street was to be built. 5 years later, in June 1823, three local men, John O'Brien, Robert Dunning, and John Dunning, conveyed by deed a piece of real estate, including the mall area, stretching from Pleasant Street to First Parish Church. The town paid them the princely sum of 5 cents, which, by the way, would be only about $1.44 today. The deed specified that the land was to be used only, quote, as a public walk or mall, unquote, forever. That's why we're celebrating the 200th anniversary of the mall this year, 2023. So there's agreement in the historical records that the area of the mall was an alder swamp before it was reclaimed. One person said it provided, quote, wonderful accommodations for grand concerts of the festive frog, unquote. However, there's no agreement on precisely when the so-called reclamation began. The Wheelers' history says on the 4th of July, 1826, quote, the citizens united in a general assault on this deformity of the village, unquote. They worked diligently until noon, listened to a speech, had lunch, and went home. A year later, they repeated the exercise. An article in the Pejepscot History Center records by Ira Booker from 1908 takes issue with the Wheelers. Booker said his research and interviews were inconclusive about whether the work on the mall was in 1824, 1825, or 26. John Cushing wrote, quote, there was a meeting called, and on the 4th of July, 1825, all classes of people met on the spot with axes, shovels, hoes, wheelbarrows, oxen, carts, and men, and they were used in demolishing trees, stumps, hillocks, and generally leveling all prominent surface irregularities, as well as to open the stream that sluggishly crept through the swamp on the west side of Main Street, through this spot designated as a proper place to have a mall, unquote. The next activity on the mall was in the late 1830s. The Wheelers' history says, quote, the project of enclosing the open area and of planting trees was started at a strawberry party in 1838, and the fence was erected and the trees set out in the spring of 1839, unquote. John Cushing wrote that in 1839, the year of Brunswick Centennial, a village improvement committee was appointed comprised of himself, Isaac Lincoln, and Joseph Griffin. They raised $300, contracted for grading, ditching, tree planting, and fence building around the whole ground, but they had to raise another $50 to pay for a cost overrun. In the course of his work, John Cushing took time off to get married. The Reverend Dr. George Adams, pastor of First Parish Church, donated his wedding fee toward the mall project. In the end, the committee was still $25 short to cover costs. They donated the funds themselves. In the middle of the 19th century, the railroad arrived here. The line connecting Brunswick to points east cut through the lower mall. I imagine people had mixed feelings about that. For years, there was still a boggy pond in the middle of the Brunswick Mall, fed by a brook. Some residents on Main Street complained it caused dampness in their cellars, or worse. In his book, Brunswick's Golden Age, Edward Kirkland wrote, quote, on the lower mall, the pool was a stinking nuisance, unquote. The pond was eventually filled in and the brook covered over. The fence was rebuilt in 1867, and you can see in this photo, taken 9 years later in 1876, see the fence clearly, I think. But by the turn of the 20th century, public opinion favored an open park. The deteriorating wood fence was removed for good in 1902. Many maps and bird's eye views of Brunswick from the late 19th century, such as this lithograph and this map, show them all on Lower Main Street. Upper Main Street was wide, but there was no mall on that stretch along the Bowdoin campus yet. In 1858, through private subscription, thanks to the Village Improvement Group, 2 rows of trees were set out along Main Street from the First Parish Church to the south end of the Bowdoin College grounds. That became the start of the mall on the Upper Main Street. These illustrations show what that part of the Upper Mall looked like in the late 19th century. Around the turn of the 20th century, there was still a lot of concern about the state of the mall. Main Street could be a muddy mess, and the selectmen reported that, quote, "The mall ought to be put under the care of some person of judgment and taste, and attention given to its condition. If the grounds were kept clean and smooth, the walks trimmed, and seats erected in different parts, what is now unsightly and of no particular interest to anyone will be made an ornament and become a point to which our people will gravitate for rest and recreation during the heat of summer, and in which we shall all feel a just pride." Well, improvements were made. On the eve of the centennial of the mall in 1922, the town voted that at least the lower mall, quote, "shall be deemed a public park. No vehicle shall be driven in said park, and except as allowed by the commission, no game shall be planned or practiced therein," unquote. Well, official games may have been banned, but for generations, the Brunswick Mall has been a popular spot for recreating year-round. Here are a few pictures to show over the years, some of the recreation there. And by the early 20th century, even the Upper Mall was showing up on maps. So during the 20th century, the mall continued to have ups and downs. In 1954, for instance, Hurricane Edna roared through town, toppling elm trees on the mall. And there have been other changes too. A century ago, there was a small gazebo on the north end of the lower mall near downtown. But in 1973, a larger gazebo was erected near the other end. It was constructed of boards sawn from pine trees that were taken down at Bowdoin College and given by the college to the town. A number of memorials have been erected on the mall also. On the south end of the lower mall is the Spanish War Square and a cannon from the Spanish-American War. On the north end, closest to downtown, is the expanded Veterans Plaza, which was dedicated in 2020 to all veterans and merchant marines from the Revolutionary War to the present. And near the gazebo is a stone and plaque commemorating the Maine bicentennial. There have also been many events and memorials related to national defense, including a plane from Brunswick Naval Air Station, Civil War reenactor encampments on the lower mall, and on the upper mall is the Joshua Chamberlain statue. In 1976, during the National Bicentennial, the lower mall was added to the National Register of Historic Places, included within the Federal Street Historic District. The Village Review District guidelines say that, quote, "The idyllic town mall runs along the east side of Park Row and is just one of the distinctive characteristics of the Federal Street neighborhoods," unquote. In 2000, a new management plan was prepared for the mall by professional landscape architects with input from many local citizens. That plan said, once again, that trouble was brewing. Quote, "Because of the mall's incremental development, separate from Brunswick's other outdoor open spaces, there exists very little in the way of policy to govern its use and care. This only serves to compound its problems," unquote. But based on the popularity of the mall now, for concerts, rallies, Civil War reenactments, bi-weekly farmers markets, food trucks, art festivals, concerts, bed races, tree lighting, ice skating, ball playing, and just hanging out, I would say that the problems have receded and that the mall is more popular than ever. So maybe what's really most notable about the Brunswick Mall is that, like our town commons, it was a private, not a public initiative. The town is responsible for maintenance of most of the mall, but the Village Improvement Association still maintains the area around the gazebo. The Brunswick Mall was part of our village center long before the so-called Malling of America became a concern to anti-sprawl activists. It's no longer a swamp. In fact, it's probably the single most beloved spot in town. The Village Improvement Association has provided vision and leadership for beautifying Brunswick, including the mall, for well over a century. Well done. This year, 2023, we celebrate the 200th anniversary of the Brunswick Mall. And thank you to everyone who provided information and illustrations for this little talk.